Can I ask everyone to take their seats, please? Apologies for the delay. We had some technical issues, and I think people tried to get in from the procession. So thank you so much for your patience. So I'd like to welcome all of you, all of our guests here at the UCL Institute of Education. This event, titled Healthcare and Humanity in Crisis, was put together in a very short period of time. But we are very honored to have a number of distinguished speakers and panelists, and also some cultural events, including music, Palestinian tapestry, poetry, and many other things. So I'm very excited for this evening. I'd like to kick things off with Dr. Ghassan Abu Sitta, just get worse and worse. And he managed to get out only a few weeks ago. I know that his heart is still in Gaza, and it is an honor to hear him speak here this evening. Thank you, Ghassan.
Thank you very much for your kind invitation. And thank you for your solidarity with our colleagues in Gaza. We are all here because we are in awe of their bravery. We are in awe of how they've come to represent what we think is the best in our profession. And the dedication that we have seen is breathtaking. And I have witnessed how colleagues have given up their lives, and I'd like to give tribute to a friend and a plastic surgeon, Dr. Ghada, who was killed by the Israelis during the war. And I've seen them juggle the unthinkable, how they've insisted on coming into work, yet not knowing whether their families are still alive. I've seen them come to the emergency department to look at the faces of the killed and the wounded to see whether their loved ones were amongst them. And I've seen, unfortunately, some of them discover their children and their nephews and nieces and brothers amongst the wounded in the emergency department at Shifa. But again, the following day they would come to work, and in between cases they would frantically try to make sure that their families are safe. I've seen how eventually they brought their families to live inside the hospital so that they can reconcile the two worries, worrying about their patients and worrying about their families. Many of my colleagues who were in Shifa after the attack on Shifa went on to other hospitals, and that was the norm in Gaza. Surgeons would move from one hospital to another whenever a hospital is damaged. When we were in Ahli Hospital over the few days after Shifa was surrounded, some of the hospital doctors who made it out came to Ahli to serve with us. Some of our colleagues, Dr. Ahmed Mukhallalati, who today when we were standing at Tommy's is a Tommy's trainee, stayed with his patients at the burns unit in Shifa Hospital, and after the Israelis withdrew and he was able to see his patients evacuated, joined the European hospital in Rafah. Dr. Muhammad Abeid, who was shot by the Israelis in Al-Awda hospital a few days ago, went from Al-Awda to Shifa. Once Shifa was surrounded, and when the Israelis evacuated, moved from Shifa to the Indonesian hospital, once the Indonesian hospital was bombed and out of service, he moved back to Laude. And that is the story of every single nurse and doctor in Gaza. Dedication to the ideal of service. There are so many of them and so many acts of bravery that one doesn't know where to start. I always, when I was there, felt that I was extremely lucky. I knew my children were safe. But they, despite not even having that luxury, continued to do the work and serve their people. When we lost colleagues, it took us a couple of hours, but they were back working after they were able to grieve for their friends. Dr. Midhat had worked at the Birds Unit for over 20 years, and my colleagues at the Birds Unit were all very close friends of his. And it literally took us a couple of hours for them to grieve their friend and cry for their friend, and then come back to work. And the following morning, they were all back there. During this war, when I went into Gaza on the morning of Monday the 9th, the worst case scenario I thought was just another 2014 war, which was a brutal and harsh war in itself. But it was very quickly evident that the difference between this war and the 2014 and all of the other wars was the difference between a flood and a tsunami. And the genocidal intent of this war became very evident from the very beginning of this war. You would look out the window and you would see a whole neighborhood go up in flames and then turn into a cloud of dust and then disappear. And these neighborhoods that were being targeted all at the same time were what people in Gaza refer to as a fire bat, left whole families of multiple generations killed. And what is even more heartbreaking is it left us with a phenomena at Shifa that we hadn't seen before. By the time Shifa Hospital collapsed, there were 120 children who were wounded but had no surviving family. And we're talking about extended families, uncles, aunts, cousins, parents, grandparents. And by the time I left Ali, there were 4 of these children in Ali Hospital. And as someone who's been doing this for 30 years now, you can tell so much about the weapons by the wounds that they cause. At the beginning of the war, we saw wounded with major burns, over 50%, with no shrapnels, which showed us that the Israelis were trying out incendiary bombs that would create a fireball that engulfs the wounded. We then saw white phosphorus that we had treated in 2009, that was being used initially in the north, and then against civilians fleeing beach refugee camp in Gaza. We saw fragmentation missiles, newly tested fragmentation Hellfire missiles that disintegrate into discs and cause amputations at levels that you don't see in regular explosives. When an adult has a guillotine-like amputation in the middle of the thigh, for those in the profession, you could see the amount of energy and the sharpness of these shrapnel. We then treated patients who had been shot by what were called quadcopters, and these were drones that had sniper guns on them, and they would be sent around the hospital to shoot at patients trying to reach the Ali Hospital. In one night we saw over 20 of these patients, including children with high velocity gunshot wounds. we saw explosives that had not been used before but were being tested by the Israelis, as they do in every war, both as part of the R&D of weapons that they manufacture, but also as a marketing tool. And in all of this time, and in all of this horror, it was the day-to-day acts of resistance of people in Gaza that, I suppose because of the darkness which shines so brilliantly, people shared everything. They took on absolute strangers into their house when their houses were being demolished. They shared food, they shared their medication, and they shared love. Families took on the orphaned, wounded children and looked after them in the hospital. Medical staff would look after the children of their colleagues, their slain colleagues, after they'd been killed. And people around Gaza resisted this world, this death world that the Israelis had invented by acts of day-to-day acts of love that they would show towards their loved ones, but also they would show towards complete strangers. The generosity which people embrace each other in Gaza, the solidarity, the communal living that now exists in Gaza as acts of solidarity against the death and the violence of the Israelis, is what will bring Gaza back to life if it's ever given a chance. Israel targeted the health sector intentionally as a way of making Gaza uninhabitable. Israeli leaders, both politicians and military leaders, have openly spoke about either calling this the second Nakba or talking openly about driving Palestinians into the Sinai desert to ethnically cleanse Gaza. But what I discovered, which I had not really comprehended in the past, and which is why we still have over 120,000 in Jabalia camp, 800,000 living in northern Gaza, why during the ceasefire, when Rafah was opened, people went back from Egypt into Gaza rather than escape, is that for Palestinians, the humiliation of becoming a refugee, as experienced by their parents and their grandparents, became a very formative part of Palestinian identity. And so when the Israelis wanted to threaten Palestinians with death in Gaza, Palestinians knew that there was a fate worse than death, and that is becoming a refugee. And that is why people will stay in Gaza and fight on in Gaza, despite the harshness of the conditions. As we speak now, the few hospitals that remain in the north are being attacked again, because every time the Israelis attack them, a few days later they restart providing services. And as we speak now, the conditions in the south, which the Israelis intentionally created, this combination of malnutrition, open wounds, overcrowding, destroyed water and sewage treatment, is beginning to take its effect in terms of epidemics of infectious diseases. There are over 1,500 cases of infectious diseases, diarrheal disease and respiratory diseases being reported every day in the south. We have had outbreaks of hepatitis. We have had outbreaks of respiratory disease. And it's only a matter of time until cholera and typhus happen. People with chronic non-communicable disease are now dying of these diseases. Diabetics run out of insulin. Patients with heart disease are running out of their medication. And cancer patients who've had their treatments interrupted are dying as a result of a lack of treatment. It's incumbent on us to move forward in the struggle to stop the carnage. And it's obvious that calls for a ceasefire have not worked. We need to replace these calls into calls for sanctions. Only sanctions will stop the Israelis, and only the threat of sanctions will force the Americans to stop the Israelis. We need to mobilize so that Israel is expelled from the World Health Organization's General Assembly. But it pays the price for killing more children in Gaza in 50 days than had died in the whole globe over a whole year. So that it's expelled from UNICEF and it's expelled from everywhere. We need to mobilize against the Israeli Medical Association. 400 of its members signed a petition calling on the Israeli army to target Palestinian hospitals in Gaza. These doctors need to be shamed so that they no longer feel that they're welcome in scientific conferences across the globe. And the Israeli Medical Association needs to be expelled, and all contact between it and British medical associations and royal colleges need to be severed. It is extremely bleak now, but I think, as I did throughout these difficult 43 days, we draw strength from our colleagues in the Palestinian Health sector in Gaza, and their strength will allow us to move forward and fight for them on their behalf. So thank you again for your solidarity, and thank you again for coming here today. Our people will win. That is the nature of history.
Thank you so much, Dr. Ghassan, for an extremely moving and emotive piece about what is happening there and the conditions on the ground firsthand. So without further ado, I'd like to move on to our panel discussion. Just before that, I wanted to mention, I'm sorry I didn't say at the start, we have a Slido code at the back, so please feel free to scan your QR code and put any questions that you'd like to ask to the panel, and we will try our best to answer some of those questions. So our panel will be led by a wonderful friend of mine, Dr. Myriam Francois. She's a journalist, a producer, director, an academic, a lady with many, many talents, and this is really her expertise. So she will be chairing the panel today, so I'd like to invite her to the stage. Thank you, Myriam. Mary will introduce all the speakers, so thank you, and I'm handing over to her now.
Would you like me to switch mics now? Yeah, great. Thank you so much. Well, look, why don't we, thank you so much for being here, everyone. I'm not going to talk too much because we really just want to hear from our speakers. So if I could invite to the stage Professor Nick Maynard, leading consultant surgeon based in Oxford, who has 25 years of experience in the field and who's been in and out of in and out of Gaza for the last 14 years. Dr Ghada Karmi, who many of you will know, who doesn't know born in Jerusalem. Ghada's life is much of the history of what we're talking tonight. So Ghada was born in Jerusalem, or Al-Quds as it's known, and forced to leave her family home as a result of Israel's creation in 1948. She is the author of numerous books, but probably the most relevant to the current discussion today is her latest one, which is called One State, the Only Democratic Future for Palestine, Israel. And our third panelist is Dr. Sui Ang. Thank you for joining us. Orthopedic surgeon. She has been out of refugee camps in Lebanon and has been in and out of Gaza. She is the co-founder and patron of the British charity Medical Aid for Palestinians. Thank you for joining us. Of course, I know Professor Ghassan Abu Sitta doesn't require any introduction, but actually I think he does. I think he does because beyond the work that he does in Gaza, he is quite possibly one of the top medical professionals in this country. He is what we call in French crème de la crème of medical professionals. We are lucky to have him in this country, and certainly I'm honoured to sit on this panel with him today. So thank you all for being here. A reminder that if you have questions, you can scan the QR code and send them through, and I will be filtering them as we go. I'd like to kick off with Dr. Ghada, if that's okay, about the history. We all know that this obviously all started on October the 7th.
Okay, is it working? Yeah, good. Okay. Hello to everybody, and thank you so much for coming. But I really feel that I must pay tribute, before I say anything more, to the heroic medical colleagues, of course Dr. Ghassan, and all the other medical professionals who have sacrificed so much and who are so courageous now working in Gaza. I salute them. You know, to attack medical personnel, to attack hospitals and ambulances and medical workers are the acts of an incompetent and a brutal and cowardly army. An army that is used only to fight and kill civilians, unable to have any, to fight combatants at this point. Something for us all to remember, that no one attacks medical facilities in the cruel way that has been happening unless they are literally unable to do anything else. And that is the problem with this whole issue. Okay, so going back slightly to history, I fear that I have reached an age where I was indeed a witness to Palestine before 1948. And so actually what we're seeing today, what we saw on October the 7th, is started more than 75 years ago, and as I can testify. And what has really happened is that in my country, Palestine, a settler colony was created called Israel. It was created by Britain, which has a special responsibility, and has been maintained ever since by Western powers. That is the reality, very briefly, of the issue of Israel. And inevitably, Palestinians have resisted, have fought against the consequences of creating the settler colony, because those consequences were ethnic cleansing of Palestine, and I am one of them, living to attest to that. At this point, something for us all to remember, that no one attacks medical facilities in the cruel way that has been happening, unless they are literally unable to do anything else. And that is the problem with this whole issue. Okay, so going back slightly to history, I feel that I have reached an age where I was indeed a witness to Palestine before 1948. And so actually what we're seeing today, what we saw on October the 7th, is started more than 75 years ago, and as I can testify. And what has really happened is that in my country, Palestine, a settler colony was created called Israel. It was created by Britain, which has a special responsibility, and has been maintained ever since by Western powers. That is the reality, very briefly, of the issue of Israel. And inevitably, Palestinians have resisted, have fought against the consequences of creating the settler colony, because those consequences were ethnic cleansing of Palestine, and I am one of them, living to attest to that. Secondly, they have led to occupation of the remaining parts of Palestine, Gaza, West Bank, and finally, they have led to what we saw today. So what we saw on October the 7th has to be seen in that context. It's not de novo, and it's not some crazy loons who fell out of Mars, who suddenly call themselves Hamas and start doing this kind of thing. It's something which was inevitable. Resistance was always inevitable amongst Palestinians, as with all peoples, historically, who have been treated in the way that the Palestinians have been treated. And what you saw on October the 7th was breaking out from the cage of Gaza by a resistance movement. That's the context. One must never forget that. And also don't forget, Hamas is a valid, legitimate Palestinian political party which was elected in 2006 by fair and free elections and should be governing. And should be governing the whole of the Palestinian areas. But for the fact that the West didn't like that, Israel didn't like that, and hence the cage of Gaza, hence the blockade, hence the maltreatment of Palestinians, whether on the West Bank or in Gaza. That is the context, and one must never ever forget it. If Chair will allow me, can I continue to say something about where we're going to go with this? Look, if we bear this in mind, this is where we're at, this is what has happened, this is grossly unjust, it's very wrong. We all know, don't we, that the only way that Israel continues to behave like this is because it is allowed to. Iranians are up against not just Israel, they're up against Israel and the United States. Now, we can't do much about the United States, but we can do something about the government of this country, which supports the US, which supports Israel, and has played a very active role in the last, this recent campaign. You know that this government and previous governments, British governments, sell arms to Israel. They share intelligence with the Israelis. They support the Americans in their support of Israel. That is something we must do something about. And we can urge, as long as we're very clear in our minds, what are the things that can be done, and then line up behind them and do it. So, at the very least, we can ask and demand that the government supports a ceasefire. At the very least, we can demand that the government of this country expels the Israeli ambassador. And we can urge and do everything in our power to publicize and be active in stopping arms sales to Israel from this country. Government legislation going through to try and outlaw BDS must be stopped. The association of the IHRA definition of anti-Semitism by this government has to end. There are numerous things that can be done and must be done. We need to do it. Unless support for Israel ends, we cannot pay tribute to our fellow professionals, or the people of Gaza, and all right-thinking people in this world. We have to target Israel, and we have to do it sensibly and intelligently, and we can start with our own government.
I'm going to make myself very unpopular at this point, and just for the sake of everyone on the panel, just remind everyone that Hamas is a proscribed organisation in this country, and so we just should be quite cautious on that level. And also, obviously, no elections since 2006, and the most recent polls out of Gaza suggest that popularity, they wouldn't have a majority today in terms of popularity. Just and the last thing is a note that I made to Omar before I came on, because I think a lot of us are very angry, understandably, about what's happening. And I just want to, I'm Muslim, and many of us here are, and just a reminder that our standards are not set by the enemies. We have our own standards for how we behave. So thank you for allowing me that side note. Nick, I wanted to bring you in, if that's okay at this point, about your experiences in Gaza, and also as a medical professional in the UK who is vocal about the Palestinian issue. I know that there are a lot of people here who have been concerned about speaking up, not just in the medical profession, but in many others. How do you yourself manage that pressure? Do you come under pressure, and how do you respond to those who may accuse you, for example, of anti-Semitism, now that we obviously have a definition which conflates anti-Semitism with support for or critique or criticism of Israel?
Thank you for that. I think I said earlier, when I was talking to the vigil, once you've been to Gaza, it has this unbelievable draw on you. You develop a passion for the place, for the people, for the land, and it's very rare, in my experience, for people to go there and not want to go back because they fall in love with the place. It is that the people there are, in my experience, unique. They're the loveliest, most beautiful people I've ever met. Many of them become very, very close to me and my family. And that's a very important context, I guess, in which to answer your question. And when you've experienced that, when you've met these people, and particularly when you see, you know, not only the absolute atrocities they're undergoing now, but actually even in quiet times, when you go there, you see what they have to live under, the fact that 99% plus of the population will never leave that country, not allowed to leave, they're in a giant prison. That provides a sort of context, which means that you almost feel you can do nothing else other than speak out about it. And I have this compelling need, as many of us do, to do so. Do we come under pressure? I mean, I think, not under personal pressure, no, but I think certainly under institutional pressure. We've tried to hold vigils in our hospital, we've been banned from doing so. We've tried to advertise healthcare vigils in our hospital, we've been banned from doing so. I was invited to talk at Cambridge University by the Medical Society there, and was given a list of topics I was not allowed to mention. They tried to censor me, they didn't succeed, and I wrote back and I wouldn't accept the invitation. They did back down, so I was allowed to talk about what I wanted to talk about. And you only have to, and I've been, along with Omar and many of my other friends, we've been in contact, as Shafi and Taz, as I know down there, and Adam and Brenda, friends of mine who come out to Gaza with me. We've all been in constant contact with our friends out there. And we ask them repeatedly, what do you want us to say? What do you want? And they want the world to know. We have this absolute obligation, duty, to talk out about this. And I couldn't ever look at those people again without doing what we're doing now. So, listen, for me, it's very, very easy. I think we all want to talk about this. It's tragic how people conflate support for the Palestinians with anti-Semitism, with support for Hamas. It's intellectually impossible for me to understand that, but yet people do.
Is there any advice you give to maybe less senior colleagues? Because I'm conscious that obviously with seniority comes an ability to speak out that maybe some of your more junior colleagues don't. Is there any advice you might give them with regards to speaking out whilst protecting themselves, obviously? Because I personally am worried about younger people in the medical profession, particularly those of us who are visibly identified as a minority community that's already under a lot of scrutiny. What advice do you have to them to protect themselves?
Yeah, and absolutely, and we do give that advice. We've got some, I mean, around the country, wonderful medical vigils in Oxford. I know, you know, a lot of the healthcare vigils are run by our medical students who are incredibly well. The advice we give, and I think, and the group of Oxford medics who you know, with Omar and Brenda and Adam and myself and a lot of us, including some junior doctors, we've debated this repeatedly. We're not politicians. I'm useless in a political debate. I think I'll probably say a few words, but I'll probably get circles run around me. So we concentrate on the humanitarian aspect. So my main advice is, please speak up, but just focus on the humanitarian catastrophe that's happening out there. You can't divorce that from politics, but don't stray to politics as much as you can. Stick to the humanitarian.
Okay, thank you very much. Sweeang, I'm conscious of speeding through so I can get to your questions, because I know a lot of you will have questions. Sweeang, if I may, I could talk to you about so many things, but I'm really, obviously, some of you might know, Sweeang used to be an evangelical Christian Zionist. And I wanted to speak to you about that, because we know that Christian Zionism is one of the most significant forces today in the expansion of settlements, in the lobbying of the US government to support Israel. Can you tell us a bit about the movement and the role that it plays in this conflict?
Probably not a lot. Is it I left that behind 41 years ago. I grew up teaching Sunday school, and for me it's just Israel, and they are the chosen people of God, and they could do no wrong, right? I think it's a winner for Israel at the time, because if you're talking about suffering, you know, the Holocaust and so on is enough to fill you with supporting Israel for anything. And then the Bible that was taught in a one-sided manner, drawn in the young mind, that, God will curse you if you do any harm to Israel. Until one day, when I actually, it was a reality check, because I saw the bombs falling on Lebanon, and I saw that it just killed women, children, destroyed schools, hospital, factories. And to my shock and horror, those people dropping the bombs were Israelis. And I asked my church, I asked my Jewish friends, nobody can give me the right answer except that the PLO was in Lebanon and Israel has to go in and get them. So it went on and on, and suddenly, suddenly is a moment of truth. I said, look, God did not command anybody to kill anybody indiscriminately. So why do we allow the name of God to be invoked in this kind of thing? So it went on, and finally one day, I couldn't take it anymore. I resigned from my job. I'm going to Lebanon, I told myself. I joined Christian Aid. I'm going to look after the wounded in Lebanon, wherever they are. Because at the time, I never knew Palestinians lived. And I went, and I ended up working for the Palestine Red Crescent Society, who treated everybody for free. And then I began to meet the people who are not the PLO, who call themselves Palestinians. And I could learn the difficult way that there are people called Palestinian refugees who lost their homes in 1948, walked across the border and find themselves in refugee camps. And the UN say they can return home, but they never did. So at that time, they have already, have children and grandchildren, and grew up refugees and died refugees. And of course, Israel succeeded in making the PLO evacuate. So 14,000 members of PLO left, undertaking never to return. And all this was underwritten by the USA in one of the peace plans, saying that they will look after the Palestinians left behind. So I went to work in Sabra Shatila refugee camp and began to learn all about the Palestinians firsthand. And I was totally bewildered. But 3 weeks later, despite the protection, Israeli tanks came in on a land invasion, surrounded Sabra and Shatila, blockaded the whole place, and there was a massacre. I was in charge of the orthopedic department when that happened, and stupidly, the BBC announced every hour that Israel has gone back into Lebanon because the PLO violated the ceasefire and left terrorists behind. And I suppose I was the only person who actually believed that. But the dead bodies that were brought in, the people who were killed, the people who were wounded, were no PLO terrorists. They were Palestinian women who showed me the embroideries, the children who looked forward to some peace. And when they died, I discovered the truth. And at that time, I think it was terrible because my whole world was shattered. For the first time, I realized that the Palestinians were victims. They were victims of all sorts of terrorism, robbed of their homes, their rights, and to die in exile and be killed. And on every dead body, and there are about 3,000 of them in the alleys of Sabra and Shatila, there is a refugee identity card saying that they came from different parts of Palestine, Gaza, Haifa, and to die in this manner. So there was a lot to go through, and I completely broke down, and I said, God, why is the whole world deceived, and why am I deceived? But it's okay to ask questions, but action is also important. As a real Christian, I got to repent. Repent of my arrogance, my ignorance, my prejudice, and bigotry. So I wanted to dedicate the rest of my life to Palestinian people, and that's why I'm here. And every person who has been brought up in life and who see the truth will also give their life for the truth. I'm not alone. There will be many more like me.
If I may, you have witnessed things that you probably would never want to recall. Those of us who have only been seeing the sparse images that the very brave journalists in Gaza have been sending through, is there anything that you would like to share with us? Any cases that you treated that particularly marked you and that you might like to share with us? I suppose either as an indication of the challenges that you faced and that your colleagues faced, or possibly additionally a story that gives you hope in some capacity. I think we're maybe in need of both a reality check with regards to what's really happening, but also some hope with regards to what we can hold on to.
On that fateful morning, around 5 o'clock in the morning, 3 days before I left Gaza, we had been operating all night into the early hours on the victims of a missile attack on a mosque in one of Gaza's old neighborhoods. And at 5 o'clock that morning, the anaesthetists told us that they had completely run out of anesthetic. There was no morphine left, there was no propofol left, there was really nothing. In the two remaining operating rooms in Ahli Baptist Hospital stopped, even though we had over 500 wounded out in the hospital. And I had, a few days before that, operated on a 13-year-old boy. He'd lost his mother and his siblings in one of the Israelis attacked their home, and he had sustained an amputation to his right leg, and his right hand was crushed, very badly crushed. And I'd done the first procedure, and it really, because of the pressures on the operating rooms, I'd done a procedure that was described in the 40s and the 50s. I buried his hand in his abdominal wall to try to kind of provide soft tissue cover for his hand, and just to buy it time so that at the second stage he can have more definitive reconstructive surgery. And when we had decided that with us running out of medication in the operating rooms, there was really no point for the surgical team to remain at the hospital, and we would move to the south. I went to the father of this child and I told him where I'd be, and I was going to move to a Sayat camp in the south, and that I gave him the name of the hospital that I'd be at. And then we made the move. We walked for over 5 hours. The Israelis had intentionally plowed this safe passage, this Salah ad-Din street that connects the north and the south, literally plowed it with the tanks, and so it was a difficult journey for 5 hours to walk as an able-bodied adult with just a rucksack. And at the end of those 5 hours walk, you get to the other side, and I remember going and joining friends and colleagues at that hospital. On the morning that I was supposed to leave Gaza, and I had made that decision because I discovered that even in the south, the situation wasn't much better. They were so short of fuel, of medication, of supplies, that the operating rooms barely functioned. And I spent the last few days just doing dressing changes and bandaging people rather than operating on them. And that morning when I was waiting for a car to come and take me to Rafah checkpoint, that boy and his father showed up at the emergency department. The father had pushed that boy on a wheelchair for those 6 hours, just to come and see me. in those proud streets. It's not enduring love. That will eventually save our people.
I've seen a lot of horrors during the Sabra Shatila and my many years at the Palestinian, but I want to leave you with this, because if I don't talk about this, then I'm not true to myself. After the Sabra Shatila, dead bodies were covering the small little refugee camp. Remember, Sabra Shatila at that time is only about 100,000, and after 3,500 were killed. There were mass graves, mutilated bodies everywhere. I've just visited a 70-year-old woman who walked 20 kilometers from South Lebanon to visit her family when she heard on the news that there was a massacre. When she arrived, 27 members of the family had been killed. All killed except a 13-year-old boy. The bodies fell on him and he fainted. But he later told me that while he had lapses of waking up, he knew that the women were being raped next door. It's very sad memory. I went to see his grandmother, basically to tell her that we will look after Munir, we will look after him, and he will survive. One member of the family will survive. But then she started talking of our children, and her grief was so overbearing that I find it very hard to get myself together. So I came out of the house into the main street of the camp, and as I come in, there were dead bodies and women screaming when their loved ones were identified. And it was a terrible scene, and I really not sure whether I want to live or it's better if I die. I don't know. And then suddenly a group of children surrounded me, and one of them was my patient. His fracture has mended. I took his plaster out, and they began to tell me all about the families, what happened to them, and they were killed, and they were alive, and then they got very happy that they are seeing me, because they thought I was also being killed, because they also knew that I tried to take over a baby and take it to safety, and that baby and the mother was shot. And then all of a sudden, more kids appeared, and they just lined themselves up and asked me to take a picture of them. They always call me a Chinese doctor. They will never believe that I always tell them I'm Britannia. No. It's a very bad country. And Chinese very, very good. Please, okay, I come from London. and so while they're queuing up, I took out my pocket camera that time that Olympus trip, and said, okay, I'll take a picture of them. And they said, take a picture and show it to all your friends, so that they believe that they are real Palestinian children. And one day, this camp might be destroyed, like our home in Palestine. So I took a picture, and then all of a sudden, they raised their hand in the victory sign, and they said, and we are not afraid, let the Israelis come. And suddenly I realized the significance of that. These are young children, and the courage was incredible. In front of them were the bodies to be identified. Behind them were their homes all destroyed, but between death and destruction are the Palestinian children. So, now, whenever life becomes difficult, and this is one very difficult moment, I want to share this with you. The Palestinian children are there, and they are our hope. So please do not despair. As long as there are Palestinian children, there will be a Palestine.
I'm finally being given about 3 minutes. minutes. I might steal 5 because there's two questions that I would really like to hear from the panel. From Ghada, obviously you've written a book about a one-state solution. We heard recently the Israeli ambassador to the UK saying something most of us knew was, Israel's stance already, but that, there will be no state solution according to the Israelis currently. Does that mean you align with the Israeli ambassador on that one? Where do you differ?
God forbid. I should be aligned with the Israeli ambassador on anything. No, it's not. Look, I don't know why there was this kind of shock or horror at what the ambassador said. It's been very obvious to all of us that the Israelis are actually not interested in supporting a Palestinian state of any kind, part of the two-state solution or any other idea. They're not interested, and they never have been. So she at least did say it openly, and that's good that she said it, because indeed Israel is not. You know very well now, the Gaza, this last crisis in Gaza has demonstrated very clearly what Israel actually wants. And all of them, I don't buy this business about extreme right-wing government, as if other Israeli governments had been so much better. And now we've got this horrible government which is making life very difficult. We know what the Israelis want. They want the whole of Palestine without the Palestinian people. And that's what they're aiming at in Gaza. Get rid of the Gazans into Sinai, the West Bank, get rid of the West Bank people into Jordan. That's what they really aim. The reason I wrote the book I wrote, you might ask, well, given that, what's the point of talking about the future? Nevertheless, of course there's a future. And of course, there is an inevitability, in my opinion, about that future. In the end, there are two sets of people living between the river and the sea. Roughly half Jewish Israelis, half Palestinian Arabs. Add to those Palestinian Arabs the Palestinians living in camps, 5 to 6 million of them, and people like me in exile. All these people have to find a solution, and the only one that I think is not only desirable and humane and moral, but actually the only one that's feasible and possible is that piece of territory is shared by the two peoples who live there. And that's what
difference is the Israeli ambassador wants one state with no Arabs, and you're saying a state with everyone with the same equal democratic rights. Those are not the same position, just to be clear. I want to do a quick fire round because you guys have sent in loads of questions, but before we get to that, Ghassan, I want to ask you one last thing, because obviously you've just come back. If there was anything that you felt that the people of Gaza might want to hear, might want us to hear, something that you feel like they want us to know, what is the message that you would take to us from the ground? What is this?
I think, and I've spoken about this, really it is that for Palestinians, particularly Palestinians in Gaza, but Palestinians across the whole of Palestine, across the world, and in the refugee camps, as Palestinians we discovered that there is something worse than death, and that is becoming a refugee. And that will never happen again. And that is the message that has come up from Gaza. You know, there are still Palestinians in Beit Lahia, which is a few minutes from the 48 armistice line. And there are over 120,000 in Jabalia refugee camp in the north. There are 800,000 still in the north. Palestinians have decided to remain in their homes, and those who move to the south move to relatives, and really down the road, literally, the whole of Gaza is 40 kilometers. And so for Palestinians, the idea of expulsion will not happen, even though that's the stated aim of the war. And we understand that what will happen in Gaza now, if it's allowed to succeed, will then happen in the West Bank, it will happen in the Galilee, it will happen in the Arab Triangle and in the Negev Desert. And Israel and its population and its military and political elites are now in the final solution frame of mind. They honestly and utterly believe that the solution to this problem is to get rid of Palestinians, to kill those who need to be killed, and expel those who survive. And that is why we need a different understanding to the struggle now. It's entered a different phase, a much bloodier phase, and for the Israelis, a much more conclusive phase.
Thank you. Because we don't have much time, thank you. Can I suggest we do quick fire questions at this point? Sorry, I know that a lot of this might require longer responses, but just because I want to get as many of these in as possible. So if we can try and keep the responses snappy, whoever feels that they can respond, please do. One of the questions, I'm sure this is true for many people who've come here today, they're saying when the slaughter and killing is over, there'll be a massive healthcare need. How can we as UK healthcare workers become involved or help? Anybody want to make any suggestions?
I think the Israelis would want to achieve what they failed to achieve during the war in the siege after by leaving people to die of their wounds and to die of their illnesses. And as healthcare workers, we have so much to offer, either as teams going in, as academics supporting the medical students there so that they wouldn't have to leave to get their training, as NGOs and charities to support rebuilding the health sector. Everyone, each one of us is able to get involved. Once the ceasefire happens, the war will not end. Siege is another weapon of war that the Israelis will attempt to use.
I'm getting signals we need to wrap up. I guess I should quickly then ask this one. This is probably the one on everyone's lips. What is the solution to the war? I hesitate to call it a war personally, but what is the solution to the current situation?
Well, first of all, there has to be an agreement, an internationally supported agreement that there has to be an instant ceasefire. At the same time as that ceasefire, the blockade of Gaza has to be lifted. Those are, to my mind, absolutely essential first conditions. After that, then the talking can start and the reckoning can start. But those two conditions are essential and immediate, and we must demand them.
Anyone else on the panel? Want to come back on that? I think I have to wrap right now. I'm really sorry because I'm sure there's so many more things that we want to discuss. Can I just, before we go here?
I think, and I've spoken about this, really it is that for Palestinians, particularly Palestinians in Gaza, but Palestinians across the whole of Palestine, across the world, and in the refugee camps, as Palestinians we discovered that there is something worse than death, and that is becoming a refugee. And that will never happen again. And that is the message that has come up from Gaza. You know, there are still Palestinians in Beit Lahia, which is a few minutes from the 48 armistice line. And there are over 120,000 in Jabalia refugee camp in the north. There are 800,000 still in the north. Palestinians have decided to remain in their homes, and those who move to the south move to relatives, and really down the road, literally, the whole of Gaza is 40 kilometers. And so for Palestinians, the idea of expulsion will not happen, even though that's the stated aim of the war. And we understand that what will happen in Gaza now, if it's allowed to succeed, will then happen in the West Bank. It will happen in the Galilee, it will happen in the Arab Triangle and in the Negev Desert. And Israel and its population and its military and political elites are now in the final solution frame of mind. They honestly and utterly believe that the solution to this problem is to get rid of Palestinians, to kill those who need to be killed, and expel those who survive. And that is why we need a different understanding to the struggle now. It's entered a different phase, a much bloodier phase, and for the Israelis, a much more conclusive phase.
Thank you. Because we don't have much time, thank you. Can I suggest we do quick fire questions at this point? Sorry, I know that a lot of this might require longer responses, but just because I want to get as many of these in as possible. So if we can try and keep the responses snappy, whoever feels that they can respond, please do. One of the questions, I'm sure this is true for many people who've come here today, they're saying when the slaughter and killing is over, there'll be a massive healthcare need. How can we as UK healthcare workers become involved or help? Anybody want to make any suggestions?
I think the Israelis will want to achieve what they failed to achieve during the war in the siege after by leaving people to die of their wounds and to die of their illnesses. As healthcare workers, we have so much to offer, either as teams going in, as academics supporting the medical students there so that they wouldn't have to leave Gaza to get their training, as NGOs and charities to support rebuilding the health sector. Everyone, each one of us is able to get involved. Once the ceasefire happens, the war will not end. Siege is another weapon of war that the Israelis will attempt to use.
I'm getting signals we need to wrap up. I guess I should quickly then ask this one. This is probably the one on everyone's lips. What is the solution to the war? I hesitate to call it a war personally, but what is the solution to the current situation?
Well, first of all, there has to be an agreement, an internationally supported agreement that there has to be an instant ceasefire. At the same time as that ceasefire, the blockade of Gaza has to be lifted. Those are, to my mind, absolutely essential first conditions. After that, then the talking can start and the reckoning can start. But those two conditions are essential and immediate, and we must demand them.
Anyone else on the panel? Want to come back on that? I think I have to wrap right now. I'm really sorry because I'm sure there's so many more things that we want to discuss. Can I just, before we go, thank all of our panelists once again for their contribution. In here about getting organised and how you can help, and listen, unity, there is power in unity, there's power in numbers. I think if this conflict has shown us anything, it's that there has been a rallying of so many diverse communities, right? We've seen, black societies, queer societies, we've seen Muslim groups, we've seen Christian groups, we've seen so many people come together. The power is in the numbers, the power is in the unity. So get together through people power, power to the people. That ultimately, I think, is the message of today anyway. Power to the people. It's amazing Palestinian art because we have to also, alongside the pain and the suffering, celebrate Palestinian culture for all that it is and all that people are trying to take from it. Because what do you do when you don't have your own culture but steal from others?
Thank you so much. Many thanks to Dr. Miriam Francois for moderating so expertly, and a special thanks to the panel who were absolutely incredible. So, as Miriam mentioned, we are now moving on to a cultural interlude. So the first of which is Al-Farai, who is joining us on stage. He is a Palestinian and Jordanian songwriter, rapper, drummer, singer, producer from Amman. And his songs come from the region's subconscious, with lyrics that archive the socio-psychological, political and personal subtext of Arab daily life, extending to the diaspora. Themes of love, borders, spirituality and identity manifest. Al-Farai's ever-reflexive raw rapping style contrasts his soulful melodies, creating chantables, anthems and crave earworms. It's an absolute honor to have him here. Thank you so much for coming.
Yeah, of course. No worries,